compared to this time last week. We're slightly stronger. Bonds are slightly lower. The gold and the yen, which I guess in a lot of ways are measures of risk appetite, are just about at the same level. So it's fairly uneventful. You do understand why people are basically squaring their positions right now ahead. Well, previously ahead of these numbers and ahead, of course, of the inauguration later on tonight. Now, I just want to look at currencies here very quickly. We have CNH, Aussie dollar, pound sterling, and the euro. I think that when you look at how some of these majors have been trading, flat really for the most part. Consolidation. There we go. Oh, let's talk about this first. All right. Emerging markets. What can I say about this? Well, if there's one thing consistent, it's really been an outflow story this week. In fact, let me just have a look at that very quickly right now since we're talking about these markets. Most markets in Asia have really seen not a lot. I mean, it's not the sort of dramatic sort of amounts that have been pulled out from these markets, say, back in the fall. That said, with the exception of India, just about every single market in Asia has actually seen money pulled out this week. That's, of course, up until this morning. We have to wait and see what today's data is going to show from these exchanges. Now, all right, have a look at majors right now and the Chinese renminbi. Now, a lot of what you're seeing across these currency markets also has to do, in fact, more of it has to do with what Janet Yellen's been saying. Now, that said, it wasn't at all a big surprise. Let me just talk about some of these numbers. That they do support, of course, a gradual rates or gradual pace of rate increases. She talked about how changing demographics in the U.S. has really pushed down the participation rate in the labor force. They're not behind the curve. Just one comment here, coming from a trader that Bloomberg talked to. Why are we seeing some slight weakness in the U.S. dollar from the time, of course, that speech went underway about an hour back? It's essentially that, essentially markets are just pairing their positions. And it was less hawkish than what markets were essentially expecting. Rish.
Right, thank you, David. Right, let's get our guess. He's expecting China growth to actually slow to 6.5% this year from the overall figure of 6.7% that we've just had, of course. Here, he's Haibin Zhu. He's from JP Morgan. Now, your China chief economist, we got 6.8% December figure. It wasn't wholly unexpected that you get a slight uptick there as well. But, what was your take on when you read the retail sales picture, the industrial production here as well?
Well, if you look at today's data, not too much surprise. Yeah, 6.8 is exactly what we're expecting. So, and I think good news is that the growth momentum is still quite stable. And you see from the IP number, you see the retail sale number, pretty tracking.
Yeah, I mean, great guns, 10% plus when it comes to retail sales. But now let's look ahead, because, you're thinking 6.5%. I mean, of course, 6.7% is not really sustainable for an economy which has reached a certain point in terms of development.
Yeah, so if you look at this year, of course, there's many issues that China still continue to need to deal with, like overcapacity reduction, inventory in the housing market. But there's some sectors, actually, we will see a turning around in the momentum. So let me highlight three. Yeah, real estate market, given the tightening in the number of cities, we expect actually modest slowdown in the housing market. Auto sales, surprisingly, had the 15% growth, very strong sales growth in 2016. And now, with some policy adjustment, then we're expecting actually the auto sale will also slow down. But the positive surprise probably will coming from the financial service. Financial service was a major drag for GDP growth in 2016 because of the adjustment in the stock market. But this drag will disappear.
Yeah, no, because, I mean, it becomes important, doesn't it, in the sense that people suddenly then realize maybe they can't make that much money out of housing. So it's the whole whack-a-mole theory as well. We get these little asset bubbles. So you're thinking that is going to be a read-through when it comes to better performance by bond market, equity markets, etc.
Yeah, so at least we saw that the stock market, big adjustments since the second half of 2015, they had the major negative effect on the GDP growth, and this negative effect will disappear.
So you're predicting a slight slowdown, 6.5% for next year?
Yeah.
Well, this year. Yeah. So where do you expect there to be drag then?
Well, the drag coming from the slowdown in the housing, and also the auto sales.
Because financial services provided a drag in 2016, what's going to be the drag in 2017?
The real estate investment slowdown, auto sales slowdown. Yeah.
These are the reasons why?
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about how the PBOC looks at this.
Yeah.
Are they going to be taking a more hawkish stance when it comes to monetary policy? Because it seems like things are okay.
Yeah, they actually, the PBOC operation, there is some nuance change. They continue to talk about prudent, neutral monetary policy. But if you look at the operation, the neutral is more in the sense of the traditional monetary policy, like the policy rate, the credit growth has been pretty stable. But if you look at the macro-prudential side, the money market, the market interest rate has been moving up, bond yields has been moving up, and the PBOC tightened the macro-prudential measures in the last 3 or 4 months. And so these, of course, are on the condition that the growth outlook is relatively stable in the near term. So given today's data, I would say they will continue to tightening in this macro-prudential side.
So you tighten, but at the same time, you're going to be still, there's no way they're going to relent when it comes to fiscal stimulus or indeed investment.
Pretty expansion last year. Actually, based on calculation, the fiscal deficit number increased quite significantly in 2016 versus 2015. That's one reason why infrastructure investment is so strong and also behind the cyclical recovery story last year. And this will continue in 2017, although we believe probably to a less extent. But again, on the monetary policy side, credit growth most likely will be stable rather than, say, picking up or slow down.
Right, but, you know, there are a couple of things.
Yeah.
We've got, of course, US-China relations, how do they evolve?
Yeah.
We don't know that yet, but one thing we probably do have more of a handle on, as an economist you do as well, and that is, of course, this capital outflow story.
Yeah.
How do they stem this?
Yeah. So this is probably the biggest near-term challenge for the policymakers. We do observe a lot of capital control measures these days, right, on individuals and also on corporates. If you look at the policy impact, the impact is quite mixed. Right? Good news is that capital outflow didn't pick up further in the last 1 or 2 months. But on the bad side, actually, it also didn't come down.
And you see how these FX reserves have been really behaving.
Right, so FX reserve continue to run down, very likely will be hit below $3 trillion US in the next few months. So the question is that, yeah, that put a lot of pressure on the domestic monetary policy operation and also put a pressure on the exchange rate policy.
Ivan, 5 seconds, where will the RMB be in 6 months?
In 6 months, we're expecting 6.20, 6.2.
Oh, so you see...
Oh, sorry, 7.2.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
You're seeing rapid appreciation.
So, yeah, depreciate against the US dollar.
Thank you very much indeed, Haibin Zhu, JP Morgan there. Right, let's get to the latest first word news headlines and head over to Sydney and join Heidi Lun. Heidi.
Rish, Donald Trump has promised to unify America when he moves into the White House. Speaking at an Inauguration Eve concert in Washington, the president-elect said the U.S. had voted for real change and vowed to carry out his campaign pledges. He told supporters he would secure America's borders and build up the military. He also promised to be a president for all the people.
It's a movement that started, and it's a movement like we've never seen anywhere in the world, they say. There's never been a movement like this. And it's something very, very special. And we're going to unify our country. And our phrase, you all know it, half of you are wearing the hat, make America great again.
The European Central Bank left policy unchanged, preferring a wait-and-watch approach on euro area inflation. The ECB reaffirmed it will run asset purchases until at least the end of 2017, while trimming the monthly pace as of April. The decision is seen as allowing a steadying hand through shocks expected from elections in France, Germany and the Netherlands, and the Trump presidency in the US.
The risks surrounding the euro area growth outlook remain tilted to the downside and relate predominantly to global factors.
The UK Prime Minister has offered her strongest support yet for the City of London as Brexit moves ever closer. Theresa May said banks are of a huge value to the British economy, with some signalling that they may move staff abroad after the UK leaves the EU. May has confirmed a full departure from the single market, sparking concern in an industry that pays the equivalent of about $80 billion in annual taxes.
I value financial services in the City of London, and I want to ensure that we can keep financial services in the City of London, and that global Britain, I believe, will do just that.
Global News 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Heidi Lun. This is Bloomberg. Rish.
Thanks. Well, still ahead this hour, finding out why IBM slumped in New York despite a beat of the forecast, breaking down the company's fourth quarter results a bit later. Plus, we've got a busy time for Janet Yellen. 2 speeches in 2 days. We've been listening to her. We'll be recapping what the Fed chair had to say about the economy and the future pace of interest rate hikes.
All good.
Trump railed against China throughout the campaign. China, he called it over and over again. What's your assessment of the depth of the sincerity of his antipathy towards China?
I can ask you guys that about everything that he has said. Nobody really knows. It's a great talking point on the campaign trail, of course, because it gives you a villain, the Chinese stealing all our jobs. But given what the Chinese are doing, the fact that they're propping up the currency, which in theory is what he wants, it's hard to know actually where he's going with this.
Caitlin, what is the state of relations between the U.S. and China right now? What are the people focus on the negative aspects, but what are the parts where it seems like the relationship is something positive that could be built on?
Well, the U.S. and China are highly integrated economies. The U.S. consumers rely on China for 90% of our smartphones, for example, for a large percentage of our laptops. And so, you know, where there are definitely tensions over currency and over other trade practices, you know, U.S. companies, including Apple and others, have really highly integrated supply chains with China.
Michael, let me ask you this. If Trump, go back to my question line before, if Trump decides to label China a currency manipulator, what happens?
Not a lot. As your piece earlier with Dan Moss pointed out, the law calls for China to be brought into well, they give them a year to come into negotiations with the U.S., and exactly what they're supposed to negotiate is left open, probably some sort of change in their exchange rate. If they don't, then after another year goes by, they can deny them financing from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation for funding for projects there. The trouble is with China, we've already cut off their access to that from Tiananmen Square, so that's not even an issue. So there really isn't anything they can do. Also, manipulation under the U.S. law, China doesn't meet the test. You can't name them a currency manipulator based on the criteria Congress has set out. So he can only do it by basically an executive order calling them names.
Right. Caitlin, if China stopped loaning money to the United States, investing in the United States, we'd be in big trouble. I've been hearing for years that that's a threat. Is there any threat if Donald Trump did something along these lines on trade, currency, that really made China angry and they said, we're going to retaliate? Could they start withdrawing money from the United States in a way that would devastate our economy?
I mean, absolutely. The U.S. is reliant on, you know, China. It's our biggest creditor. Well, actually, Japan has very recently overtaken it as its biggest creditor. But I mean, I think, yeah, the stakes couldn't be. You really can't overestimate the stakes with a trade war with China. You know,
but what would the effect be if China did that? Would there be a lot of downside for them, and therefore they might be reluctant to do it?
I mean, absolutely, because China, of course, relies on us for, you know, a lot of, you know, we buy so many of their products, and U.S. companies invest so much in their economy. I mean, that's why, you know, both parties, I think, you know, once they get down to the negotiating table, will be really reluctant to, you know, really have those negotiations break down and see a full-scale trade war.
Trump talked tough on China. As you said, we don't really know how much he means it, how much he'll fight for it. How much sentiment is there in Congress amongst Republicans and Democrats to be tough on China, where there'd be an anti-China coalition that Trump could rally if he wanted to do something with Congress?
You have a divide. You have the trade state Congress people who blame China. You remember back in the 90s when we had people bashing Toyotas in on Capitol Hill, Marcy Kaptur and her sledgehammer. You have that constituency, but then you have a lot of free trade Republicans who wouldn't like this because the Chinese are likely to, as she said, retaliate somehow, put some sanctions on that would hurt companies. They could certainly hurt the electronics industry. They could hurt Boeing. Boeing sells about 5% of its jets to the Chinese. Agriculture. Hello, Iowa. They could put sanctions on U.S. agricultural imports. So there's a lot the Chinese could do. They probably won't sell U.S. Treasury bonds because if you do a fire sale of Treasury bonds, the price goes down. They lose money. But we do need them to keep buying, especially especially if Trump, in his other economic policies, is going to run up the deficit again.
Right. Caitlin Weber, Michael McKee, thank you for doing this. Up next, the changing climate of the White House's approach to climate change. We'll talk about Donald Trump and global warming after these words from our sponsors.
As with so many other things, Donald Trump hasn't been totally clear about his view of global warming. In November, he told the New York Times editorial board he believed there was, quote, some connectivity between human activity and climate change, and yet that's not quite what he said last month in this interview with Fox News.
Where are you on the environment?
I'm still open-minded. Nobody really knows. Look, I'm somebody that gets it. And nobody really knows. It's not something that's so hard and fast. Now, Paris, I'm studying. I do say this. I don't want that agreement to put us at a competitive disadvantage with other countries. And as you know, there are different times and different time limits on that agreement. I don't want that to give China or other countries signing agreements an advantage over us.
Joining us now to talk about climate change skepticism in Trump world is Bloomberg's renewable energy reporter, the Joe Ryan. Joe, Happy New Year. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Before we get to Trump, I just want to ask you about the Obama administration. Climate change was a huge priority of Barack Obama from the time he was a candidate in 2007, 2008. Where is his legacy? Where is his record? What did he get done? What was not done in terms of his aspirations?
Sure. Well, wind and solar power grew astronomically under Obama. For the last 3 years, wind and solar have been the biggest power additions to the grid. And at the end of 2015, he really scored a big victory when Congress passed extensions of two really key federal subsidies for wind and solar that may enable those technologies to continue to grow even over the next couple of years as Trump takes office.
And is Trump, whatever else he does on coal or drilling, on those things renewable? Does its indication of whether he's pro or anti?
Well, he has made it pretty clear that he wants to increase use of fossil fuels. And he's made it pretty clear that he is fairly skeptical about the economics of wind and solar power. And, you know, But it's hard to say what he'll do once he takes office. The truth of the matter is, not a lot of this is powered by Washington. You know, the growth of renewables is largely powered by state law, and you know there are dozens of states that have really ambitious clean energy targets. You know, and even since Obama was elected, Ohio, Michigan, and Illinois have all expanded their clean energy targets, and all three of those are Republican governors, by the way.
So these are all things that are on the things that Obama got done. There's also regulatory stuff, and then there's Paris, right? So there's all that stuff. Trump comes in, puts Scott Pruitt at the EPA. It's a pretty strong signal that he is pretty hostile to that environmental agenda of President Obama's. If he wanted to try to tear it all down, everything President Obama achieved, how would he do it, and how successful could he be at just basically wiping out everything Obama accomplished in this area?
Well, in short, he can work around the margins, but he can't tear the whole thing down. You know, he can and probably will dismantle the Clean Power Plan, which was Obama's signature environmental initiative, and that requires electricity generators to use cleaner fuels. But the truth is, even as that law is hung up in court, utility companies are already cutting their carbon emissions. And part of that is the state regulations I talked about a moment ago. But then the other piece is economics. You know, fracking has made natural gas so much cheaper than coal, and natural gas is much cleaner burning than coal. And so we have utility companies closing coal plants and replacing them with natural gas plants, and to a lesser extent with wind farms and solar farms, which in many parts of the country are becoming competitive with coal. And that's really economics driving those. And so while he can roll back environmental regulations that'll make it easier on coal companies, and he can make it easier for utilities to continue to use coal plants, you know, these utilities plan their generation a decade out in advance, and they've already planned to do natural gas plants and wind farms and solar farms, and they're not just going to turn on a dime.
We're about 15 years into the notion of a renaissance for a bipartisan belief in nuclear, and yet we're still not building nuclear facilities. Any indication of whether Trump will push for the construction of nuclear plants?
You know, he has spoken favorably about it, but the economics aren't there for nuclear either, and it's a lot of the same, it's facing the same challenges.
But if you cut the regulatory hurdles on nuclear, that's been a fairly big obstacle to people being willing to invest.
Still not as cheap as natural gas, though. You know, fracking has just made that technology so economical.
Right. It's a fracking America. Joe Ryan, thank you very much. Up next, we're going to talk about Donald Trump's posture towards Russian President Vladimir Putin after a short break.
American intelligence officials have, quote, high confidence that Russian President Vladimir Putin was the driving force behind a campaign to interfere in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, discredit Hillary Clinton, and undermine confidence in the American democratic system. Those findings, plus long-held concerns about possible ties between the Russian government and Trump world, have triggered bipartisan calls for investigative hearings on Russian hacking on Capitol Hill. Meanwhile, President-elect Trump continues to take a friendly posture towards Russia and its leadership. Our team caught up with Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwait and, given everything that's been happening over these past few months, asked him to reflect on his interview with the Russian President Vladimir Putin last September.
What's interesting about that interview looking back is that Putin sort of it started a fight with Hillary.
Does it even matter who hacked this data from the campaign headquarters of Mrs. Clinton? The important thing is the content that was given to the public, specifically that the campaign headquarters worked in the interests of one of the candidates, in this case Mrs. Clinton, rather than equally for all of the Democratic Party candidates.
Hillary immediately reacted to what Putin said about her in the interview, and then Trump criticized Hillary, and then another round of Putin went through. I think the really interesting question is, who did Putin really deep down want to win? I think he wanted Trump to win from the perspective of just showing that he had influence, showing that he was able to do things and that this was his guy. But at least part of him on the international stage, I think, would have been happier with Hillary. Putin, I think, genuinely always wants to be the guy who's going to be the surprise. And as we've already seen, or as we already expect to see, Trump is someone who could be the surpriser. You don't want to be outflanked as being the most exciting man at the party. And that, I think, Putin's advantage has always been that he's been less predictable than other people. Well, if you have the most powerful man in the world being one of the least predictable, that makes it harder for him in some ways. I think the ideal solution for Putin was a weak Hillary presidency, in some ways at least. But against that, that's what I thought at the time. You now look at all the publicity and all the things that he has gained from what has happened. I mean, Putin now stands there, a very kind of big figure in American politics, and that really matters a lot to him. And it's really rather astounding if you look back at it. Putin was someone who was a slightly kind of joke figure only 3 or 4 years ago. Now suddenly he's back in the front rank. You know, the world's most powerful nation seems to be keen on having a slightly friendlier relationship with him. Several European countries are making the same noise. You know, he's back in the ranks again, and that does make a difference. Obama was very dismissive about Putin. He pointed out that he was running Russia's economy badly, that essentially Russia was a second-rate power. And that's true. You know, Russia is no longer at the same level of power as America, but what Putin's shown is it's possible to do quite a lot in that second-rate league. What Trump has done is Trump has built him up. He's talked about him being a great leader. These are all things which help Putin on both scales. They help Putin away from home, because suddenly Putin is seen as a man to be reckoned in the Middle East, a man to be talked to in different places. That he quite likes. But also at home, the idea of Putin still as a czar is a cliched way to look at it, but that is the way that Russians are very obviously, for good and bad reasons, drawn towards strong leaders. And the fact that Trump keeps on saying these nice things about Putin, which even the Russians know is not necessarily the world's nicest man, that makes them think that Putin is smarter than Trump, because, hell, he'll outwit him every stage of the game.
As far as hacking, I think it was Russia, but I think we also get hacked by other countries and other people.
I think we'll never know what damage Putin did to the U.S. democratic process. Donald Trump won by a reasonable margin in quite a lot of states, and that we'll never know. The issue of hacking will stay for quite some time, because basically cybersecurity, all these things are zones of problem, to be honest, between Russia and America. A lot will depend on whether Russia continues to do this stuff now Donald Trump is president, because it's pretty clear they have been doing stuff. The other issue, very strongly in the background, is China. China, there seems, we have no evidence of this, there seems to be a kind of deal done where with Obama at least, the Chinese stop doing things. Well, Donald Trump is being nice to Russia and horrible to China. The chances surely are that the Chinese will be more aggressive in that particular field than they've been before, and that could have consequences. That's one set of issues. Another set of issues is just basically the fact that Donald Trump is now in charge of American security. And if you get told by your security people, look, this is what's happening, and most of the instances, it's relatively, as I understand it, relatively easy to indicate where at least some of these things are starting. If they are consistently starting in Russia, then he will have to deal with that. I think there is some element of credibility in the idea that this is what countries do. You know, very obviously, America does it as well. And I think actually there is some justifiable indignance from the Chinese in particular, is that they get slightly fed up with the idea of the Americans lecturing them about cybersecurity when they know that probably the most, you know, one of the main users of this, albeit not quite in the same commercial way as both China and Russia seem to have done it, has been America. And it makes sense. This is an arms race. America is the most powerful country in the world. If you were president, you would want to have the best cybersecurity, and that is a mixture between offense and defense. And even if you claim you're trying to do defense the whole time, the ability to go and see what's happening inside the Kremlin, see what's happening inside Beijing, that is worth a great deal. It's very difficult to work out what exactly the real contacts, such as they are, between Trump and Russia. As far as I can make out, and I'm not an expert in this, is that Donald Trump's business interests in Russia are fairly minimal. To some extent, he exaggerated things like his contacts with Putin when he was merely running a Miss World pageant or whatever. It was a beauty pageant in Russia. He's not, as far as anyone can see from the outside, sort of deeply involved in Russia from a business point of view. So I think that is a kind of canard which people have probably leveled at him too much.
I don't know that I'm going to get along with Vladimir Putin. I hope I do, but there's a good chance I won't. And if I don't, do you honestly believe that Hillary would be tougher on Putin than me? Does anybody in this room really believe that?
At this precise moment, you know, Donald Trump is a very useful friend for Vladimir Putin to have. You know, that here is some cover. He has spent a long time telling people that, you know, he is not against the West at all, that he is he's not trying to establish the old Soviet Union or do anything like this. Well, he now has a president in America who is somehow at least prepared to go along with some of that and say, no, this is a stand-up guy in a sense. If you look at Trump and Putin, there has to be some sense in which this honeymoon is, at the very least, it's not going to be as happy a marriage as the honeymoon. You would expect just the sheer problem of national interest to begin to emerge. At the moment, Russia's interests and America's interests, even America's interest as redefined by Donald Trump, would seem to be in too great a contradiction. And there are also problems on top of it. At the moment, it has suited Donald Trump to point out that Putin has been running rings around Obama in different areas. Now he will be the president. And when people look at the Middle East, they're going to say, look, you're president of America, what are you doing about it? If it looks as if Russia is actually running that, that will begin to challenge the Trump authority. If it looks as if Russia is doing cyber warfare, different versions of that on America, that again is challenging Donald Trump's authority. If he pushes Trump on, say, the Baltics, at the moment, some people around Trump talk about the Baltics being like the suburbs of St. Petersburg. These are members of NATO. You know, there is some precedent for this, even with people who we now associate as much more kind of heroic big people. You look at Margaret Thatcher, you know, she was suddenly hit by this thing in the Falklands, these strange islands many, many miles away, and it was only when she suddenly realized how crucial this was, not just to Britain, or whether it was crucial to Britain or not is a long argument, but it was certainly crucial to her political reputation. You know, people don't like an American president who appears weak. Well, if Trump ends up in a position where it looks as if Putin is consistently outsmarting him, that is not going to be in Donald Trump's interest. Syria is the place where Putin's sort of ability to be able to operate in a vacuum of American power, this is the place, this is exhibit A of what he's managed to do. And, you know, he has done something, whether one agrees with it or not. He's managed to keep Assad in power. He's sort of, actually, it seems as far as one can work out, you know, he is kept Assad in power for much longer than anyone ever expected. It looks like Assad will stay in power. Well, you know, now Donald Trump is in effect the American president, and he has said repeatedly that he doesn't want to get involved in these things, but whether he likes it or not, America is de facto involved in this. America is the world's policeman, and you either have to turn a blind eye to what is happening in Syria, or else you feel ashamed about it. And I think even Donald Trump will find it difficult to turn back on some of the things which are happening in Syria because they're horrible. I think the interesting question to ask Putin now is, you know, how do you play Trump? you may not get a very straight answer, but you know the basic answer, the basic question is how do you do it? You have somehow, and I'm sure Putin is just as surprised by his success in doing this. You know, that he's managed to have some effect. We don't know what it was on the American election. He's managed to become somebody who the President of America talks about in the terms he talks about. He's become somebody who people talk about in the American political environment in a way they never did before. All those things have happened, and so Putin is now suddenly in a position which I don't think he ever expected to be in much the same way as you might argue Donald Trump is in a position he didn't possibly expect to be in. And so for Putin, the real question is, you know, where do you take it from here? You know, if you keep on doing the things you are doing around the world, you are going to have problems with America. If you stop doing those things, you may have some problems at home, and that's the balance for him. He has put himself back right at the center of American politics. You know, no Russian leader has done that for a very, very long time.
Our thanks to John Micklethwaite. Trump in the Middle East is next. We'll be right back.
Perhaps no area of the planet will test Donald Trump's foreign policy instincts more and more quickly in the coming months than the Middle East, where the next leader of the free world will inherit a nuclear deal with Iran, a struggling effort to defeat ISIS, a civil war in Syria, and, of course, the ongoing conflict in Israel. Joining us now are two people who know Middle East politics well, Bloomberg national security reporter Nafisa Saeed and Dan Senor, former foreign policy advisor to Mitt Romney's presidential campaign and an informal advisor to the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. Welcome to you both. I want to start talking about Israel, where there's been a lot of activity during the transition, and ask you, you're very concerned throughout the campaign about Donald Trump's instincts. Based on what he's done on Israel since he won, how are you feeling about his policies towards a country you care a lot about?
So far, so good in terms of a real-time issue we had to deal with, which was managing the U.S. response, or not managing the U.S. response, trying to shape the response.
Annotating it.
Yeah, trying to shape the response to the fight at the UN Security Council over the resolution that the U.S. abstained on that passed. And I actually think part of why some countries on the Security Council, or one in particular, pulled back, why another country on the Security Council, the UK, actually made a blistering criticism of what Secretary Kerry had said about the Middle East. This was all in response to Trump and all them figuring out how to maneuver around Trump. And so I think he handled that well. I think he's putting a good team around him. I think people are focused. At the end of the day, it's the Secretary of State and the Defense Secretary that will matter most here. I think he's putting a good team around him. And you know, it's going to start getting complex, particularly with this move of the embassy to Jerusalem. in terms of some decisions we have to make pretty early. But so far, I've been cautiously optimistic.
Every recent president has at some point or more than one point in their term in office said, I'm going to be the one who gets the deal between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Obviously, there's always, you can list a long list of things to say, here's why a deal's not possible right now. What's on the plus side? Is there anything the Trump administration, if Donald Trump says, I'm going to be the one who makes a deal, and he said that at times during the campaign, what's on the plus side where the conditions are ripe for a deal?
Right. He said on the campaign that could be one of his greatest achievements if he's able to actually broker that. And I guess if you want to say plus side, if you have Netanyahu and the Likud in Israel saying that he's somebody that they can work with, a partner. So there's that. But at the same time, you know, in terms of who he's appointed as U.S. ambassador, you know, somebody who might be skeptical of two-state solutions. So is he going to be able to, you know, is he going to believe in that policy, or is he going to, how are the Palestinians going to respond? So it could just be having somebody new that both parties will be willing to sit down and talk to. So that could be just having a fresh face, could be, you know, because having Obama did get very far in that sense.
Syria. Obviously the hottest of hotspots and a bloodbath of late. Donald Trump said for a long time we should not be involved in the civil war. He seemed to have moved a little bit in recent weeks. What do we expect to see, given that ongoing crisis? What do you expect to see from Donald Trump in the early days of the administration?
Well, we've heard from Donald Trump and even Rex Tillerson, his pick for Secretary of State, very strong words even in recent weeks that fighting ISIS, Islamic State, is their foremost priority in the Middle East. So that sort of tells you straight up what their policy in the Middle East is going to be. He's talked about bombing the hell out of ISIS. He says we have more problems than Bashar al-Assad, the president, and because he's been advocating for warmer relations with Russia. So we can see that there could be a game changer in terms of who he's going to be aligning with and whether that can solve certain issues in Syria. Now, Trump has also said that he would support safe zones in Syria, which President Obama has not supported. And so that could also create a change there as well. Right. Russia has said that the U.S. can get involved in Syria in the ceasefire agreement once Trump is in power. We've also heard from Turkey as well that if Trump, advocating for Trump to get involved also in terms of fighting ISIS. So I think we could see new alliances that we haven't seen before.
Dan is obviously bursting at the seams to get in here, so please.
No, I am struck by the reaction I've heard, not just from Jerusalem, but from capitals throughout the region. People are looking forward to this transition. I mean, you talk to officials, particularly in the Gulf countries, in the Persian Gulf countries, and in Cairo. So I would say that Egypt and the Persian Gulf countries and Israel, they all saying one thing in common. They're looking for a transition, looking forward to the transition. Why? In part because they believe that Obama has had this ISIS-first strategy, and that ISIS-first strategy has translated into effectively turning a blind eye to what Iran has been doing in the region. Iran is fighting proxy wars in Yemen and Libya and Iraq, and it makes these Gulf countries nervous. They want to engage Trump, but if they start to see that the Trump administration's policy is just going to be a I don't think it will be, but if they believe it's going to be a continuation of the Obama policy, which is ISIS first, we'll turn a blind eye to Iran. Iran is sort of our informal ally in defeating ISIS. That will cool the enthusiasm you're currently hearing.
I want to just ask you this question because there's literally no one who we had on this show for the course of 2 years who was more adamantly never Trump. And yet here you sit, sounding, you know, expressing a great degree of equanimity suddenly about Donald Trump. So, like just globally, as we and stick with this region, but what is it that's going on here with you? And suddenly, well, it seems like Trump might be kind of good in this area.
Well, first of all, I say I'm both cautious and optimistic. So I underline cautious. Okay, I'm most impressed by some of his personnel picks. Okay, I mean, if you had told me a year ago that Jim Mattis would be our next defense secretary, if you had told me that Betsy DeVos would be our next secretary of education, I can go down the list. I'm not.
Stay with foreign policy here.
Okay. It's an impressive team that he's putting together, and I'm familiar with some of the other names they're considering for some of the sub-cabinet posts, and it's a serious group of people. Now, I think the challenge will be, I think Trump's instincts on a lot of these issues in the Middle East are good. They're, or at least what I've been hearing over the transition, they're where I am, and I like the people he's appointing. The big challenge, which I don't know if they fully are focused on right now, is how to manage the permanent bureaucracy. So it is one thing to have a president whose instincts are in the right place. It's another thing whose cabinet secretary's instincts are in the right place. But the State Department has 65,000, 70,000 employees, and they have a history of not always implementing with speed and efficiency the president's priorities. And I have a feeling if there's ever a president's priorities that the permanent bureaucracy in Washington is going to be concerned about or slow to implement, it is this president's. And so they need to get their arms around how they're going to manage the bureaucracy. But the things they're saying, I'm encouraged by. I'm concerned about Russia. Obviously, I'm concerned about Putin. But the Middle East, I've been encouraged.
With less than 30 seconds, let's just talk briefly about Turkey and what you think Trump's options are there in terms of reshaping the relationship.
Sure. Well, we have the Gulen movement, and Erdogan has been very against that. His national security advisor, Lieutenant General Flynn, is not a fan of Gulen, so that could shape how Donald Trump responds to Turkey, and maybe there could be some warming of relations there as well. And he'll be less likely to, say, criticize human rights and freedom of press, which Erdogan has pushed back against the U.S., especially under Obama.
Right.
So we could see some ties there in terms of responding to ISIS as well.
I think that's going to happen. All right, Nafisa Saeed, Dan Senor, thank you both. We'll be back shortly with some thoughts on Trump's first 100 days on the world stage right after this.
Past hour, we've been talking about Donald Trump's approach to global affairs. So, Mark, on the basis of everything that we've seen so far from the president-elect, how do you think Donald Trump will approach the role of leader of the free world?
The way he approaches everything, it will be unorthodox. People who are concerned, with some justification that there'll be some sort of cataclysmic, horrible event, are going to be on the watch to see what happens. I think you see in National Security Advisor Flynn, someone who people think adds instability, but in the case of Mattis and Tillerson, people see more stability. Pence adds stability, the vice president coming in. It's going to be a wild part of this first 100 days. I don't think, unless there's a provocation, that it'll be as focused on its domestic policy, but it'll be wild.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you know, the world will be watching. I mean, always when you get a new president coming in, the world is watching and taking the measure of the man. People around the world have been taking the measure of Donald Trump throughout the campaign, throughout his time as president-elect. And I would say, as a consensus thing, there are some exceptions. Dan Senor seemed to suggest that there were some. I think there's a greater degree of global concern about Trump than there's been in a very long time. So it's going to matter a lot how he conducts himself. Again, put aside the question of a provocation, which would obviously be a particular kind of testing. It's going to matter a lot. And the kind of thing where it would do him so much good to be just a little bit more conventional in this area, because there is just, you know, there's being a pottery breaker, bring out an egg breaker and make an omelet or whatever on the domestic front is one thing, doing it on the global stage is another thing. World markets matter.
Yeah.
There's a lot at stake.
One of the questions, nobody thinks Trump's going to be managed. He's his own communications director. But will people like Sean Spicer, the press secretary, communications director, will they have a role in this stuff? Will the State Department spokesperson, in other words, will there be an attempt to shape Trump's foreign policy? I think Trump's going to want, like he always does, wins on the board, ability to go out and say, look what I did. And I think in foreign policy, in some ways, they're easier to get. President can act more unilaterally. So watch for that to happen. And for Trump himself and his team to trumpet those things, pretty big.
Stakes are high. We'll be right back with a few closing words.
Thanks for watching our coverage of Donald Trump's inauguration week. We're going to be back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV at 11 Eastern Time. Live coverage of the Trump inauguration, the ceremony, followed later in the day, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, with a special, with all due respect. Bloomberg Technology is up next. Until tomorrow, Inauguration Day, sayonara.
Paul Ryan is here. He was re-elected Speaker of the House earlier this month, winning the support of all but one House Republican. He's also now in his 10th term representing Wisconsin's 1st District. The New York Times described him as the steward of conservative policymaking, long considered the party's intellectual core. GOP lawmakers have an ambitious agenda as they embark on an era of unified Republican government. Their initial focus is on reversing Obama administration policies, starting with dismantling and replacing Obamacare. Other items on the agenda include repealing regulations, overhauling the tax code, and immigration reform. I am pleased to have Speaker Ryan back at this table. Welcome.
Thanks for having me back. Good to be with you.
We are at a historic moment, a transition from one president to another. Give me your assessment of Barack Obama, who this afternoon held his final press conference.
My assessment of the Obama presidency?
Yes, sir. And the man you knew.
Well, so you'll get this from a conservative standpoint. Well, actually, I like the man I know. I enjoy. He'd be a great next-door neighbor. Yeah. I just don't like him as president. So
he'd make a good neighbor, but not in your judgment.
Yeah, he's the guy who'd shovel your walk when you're, on spring break with your kids during a snowstorm or something like that. Let me start with some positive thing. He's a very good family man, and I think he set a great example as a good family man. And I think that's important. I think this is a presidency of massive missed potential. I think he came in with a track record of being an ideologue, a very left progressive, so that looked like that's what he could become. But he ran a campaign in 2008 as a tonal moderate, as a moderate. And so there was, for a moment, a lot of promise that he might move to the middle and be a moderate president with his incredible gifts of his no one can communicate like him. He's very gifted at this. He had an opportunity, I think, to be more of a unifying president if he were to become a centrist, but he was a dividing president because he stayed hard left. And I think his view of government and the Constitution is one that is